All right, thank you everybody for coming to Moving the Mass Part 6. I think it's 6 of 7, so this is second to last. We're almost there. We're almost home. But tonight we'll be covering the very interesting sugya of Torah and Prophecy. Prophecy is a very fascinating subject. We'll maybe give a little bit of like a hakdama and a background to prophecy in general, but we'll be focusing on a specific aspect of prophecy that we'll get to throughout the shir. But again, the shir is sponsored by Eitan Barak as a schus for Yehonasan, Adav Mordechai, Daniel, Eliezer, Bnei Shmuel, Susan. May Hashem return them to their families speedily and grant them Yeshua. They very much need it.
Amen.
Okay. So tonight, again, the topic is Torah and Prophecy. So these are two separate topics. Torah, we've been discussing, I think, a lot up until now. And really, it's the basis of this entire concept of having the world be a reflection of a higher reality, because the Torah is the blueprint for reality. So therefore, if it's a blueprint for reality, it's the film through which reality is projected. And therefore, everything that exists on the film is going to exist in reality. So that's why the Torah is the source of everything that's in this world. Which is why when you learn Torah, again, it's not just a book, it's not just information, it is one with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and it is a very accurate and loyal reflection of the world. To the extent that we spoke about last time, that when you paskin Torah, when Chachamim have the ability to generate Torah, which is Torah Sheba'al Peh, it's generated from within the Jewish people, it can actually alter reality. It can change reality. Because, again, they're able to change the blueprint. They're able to kind of play with the genetic code that then unfolds into reality. So that's what happens when you learn Torah in a very deep way. The Gedolei Hador, this is the concept of Das Torah. Some people don't have a really a good grasp on like, what's Das Torah? Like, why would you ask a Talmid Chacham, or let's say a Gadol Hador, questions on matters that are unrelated to Torah, that are secular in their nature? You want his opinion on something. So in the Haredi world, they call it Das Torah. This is like the Das of Torah. So you'd ask, like, he's not paskening. You're not asking him a shaila necessarily. You're asking him his opinion. So you could say maybe he doesn't know as much about this topic as someone secular, maybe someone non-Jewish. So why is his opinion so valuable? So when it comes to a general rabbi, that is a good question. Maybe you should ask a more competent source. But when you get to a certain level of sage, a certain level of Talmid Chacham, which gets into the level of a tzaddik and what we call a gadol, where he is the Torah authority of that generation, so Hashem vests him with a certain level of understanding that he's plugged into Torah. He's so plugged into Torah that he can actually tell you what his opinion is on any matter, and it will actually reflect the Das Torah. That's what they call it, Das Torah. It's really, you're not asking him, right? This person has so nullified himself to the Torah that what you're doing is you're trying to ask a walking, breathing Torah. That's your goal. Because you want to know, what does Hashem say in this situation? So there are individuals that align themselves so accurately and so exactly with Hashem's Torah that they reach this level, which is this concept called Das Torah. That you can ask them any question, and their ratzon, whatever their understanding, should reflect God's understanding. Because, so what's this level called? We'll see it in a little bit, but it's called bittul. There's a certain individual who has completely nullified himself to Torah. He's nullified himself to Torah, which really means he's nullified himself to Hashem. But his every action, literally every tiny movement of his body, is dictated by what the Torah tells him to do. He can't fathom anything other than that. When he sees reality, it's almost like he has like Terminator, like he has like his like glasses on. He sees halacha. He sees like everything, like the measurements, and this is the heichel, and that's the Torah, and he sees Shulchan Aruch in front of his eyes. It's Shivisi Hashem lenegdi tamid. They were actually tzaddikim. This is the beginning of Shulchan Aruch begins. The Ramah says, Shivisi Hashem lenegdi tamid. I should place Hashem before me constantly. So there were tzaddikim that actually pictured the Shem Hashem. They said Yud Kei Vav Kei in front of them at all times. They would see Hashem's name in front of them at all times. They literally had these goggles on that they saw reality through the Torah. When you reach a level like that, where you've kind of nullified your own will, so when you ask someone like that their opinion, so it's not their opinion, it's Das Torah. It's the Torah's opinion. and therefore their machshavas, their thoughts, overflow into areas that are, let's say, outside of classic halacha. So this is this concept of das Torah. Now that only makes sense if we understand what the Torah is. If this person was just an expert in a field, like he's a doctor, and he just knows the textbook code, and everything he does is al-pi, the medical textbook, so that doesn't necessarily mean his opinion should really matter in any area outside of medicine. Right? It doesn't apply if Torah is information. It only applies if Torah is one with Hashem. If Torah is the will of Hashem, if it's the blueprint of reality, if it defines what is good and what is evil in the world. So at that point, if that's our understanding of Torah, so if a person aligns himself so accurately and exactly with the Torah's will, so then he can permeate himself with Torah and with Hashem's will. So it doesn't work with other chachmas. That's why it's unique to Torah. Questions? Any questions on that concept? But it's a concept that's foreign to some people when they really just are bothered by why we're asking their opinions in other areas. That's the concept. Now, who does it apply to? That's up for debate. Who has become das Torah? Who's nullified themselves so much that it's not their opinion, it's the Torah's opinion? Okay, that's up for debate.
So what you're saying is that when you reach a level where Hashem grants you specific Torah knowledge, then you reach prophecy.
We call it Ruach HaKodesh, but yeah, because prophecy is the direct word of Hashem. These people aren't infallible. They can make mistakes. Prophecy means that Hashem is giving you the answer. These people are the best shot we have.
Right, but if they're speaking Torah to everyone because it comes naturally, they're so knowledgeable, they reach a level like that. They're actually doing Hashem's will and speaking His language, so it's prophecy.
We'll see. Well, tonight's year is prophecy, so we'll see. But I'll just for argument's sake, we call it Ruach HaKodesh. Prophecy, we'll see, but it's very close. What's the difference? I'm not exactly sure. Ruach HaKodesh is divine inspiration. So
we don't have to necessarily recognize who they are, and so usually they're not who we think they are.
There are some that are hidden, but then there are some that you should probably know who they are.
There's to say somewhere that in every generation there's a tzaddik that lives both in this world and in the other Muhammad. So there's always one live person sitting on the Bezdin Shal Maila.
So
someone comes up and sits by the three Dayanim. Two of them are not living anymore. One of them is still alive.
It's amazing.
There's a story about a Yid who met him in both this world and that world. Somehow he has to come down to this world for another 26 years. The same person, he has to live another 26 years. And before he died, after the 26 years, he went to see this Rebbe that he knew was in, and he pushed his way all the way up to the front, and he was staring at the Rebbe, and the Rebbe said, "What's wrong? You don't recognize me?"
And he said, "No." I mean, the Gemara says there's Lamed Vav Tzadikim. There's 36 Tzadikim, and then different Perushim say there might be 36 in Eretz Yisrael and 36 in Chutz La'aretz. But I'm not sure if all the tzaddikim who falls into this category, but it's a category theoretically that exists. Okay, so what are the questions we're going to answer tonight? So first, let's delve into the topic of Torah. So what is Torah, and how does Torah exist in the higher worlds? So we started speaking about this last year, and we mentioned that there's a very famous Ramban, and that the Ramban is trying to answer the question of what is Torah and what did it look like before this world was created. Torah preceded the world. So what did it look like before it was created, before the world was created? It can't be talking about things that didn't exist yet. Not only that, but half of the stories in Torah occurred after the Torah was given. The whole Sefer Devarim is a big speech by Moshe Rabbeinu. So that didn't happen yet when the Torah was given. So what did Hashem give Moshe Rabbeinu? He didn't get. It says that he was given the whole Torah, but those events didn't happen. So he was given the future. Everyone knew exactly what was going to happen. The whole Sefer Bamidbar happened after the Torah was given, so they knew they were going to have the Cheder Meraglim. There's many events in the Torah that didn't happen yet. So what was given to Moshe? What was the whole Torah at that point? We weren't given a piece of it. Har Sinai, right? The whole Torah. So the Ramban explains that the Torah exists in different dimensions. Like we said throughout many of these shurim, that there's many different worlds. There's a whole trickle-down system called Seder Hishtalshelus, where spiritual things exist in the higher world, and they continuously filter down through different dimensions until they get to the physical world and they manifest and crystallize as this world where Hashem is completely concealed. The Torah works the same way. We said last week that there's the Torah that the angels learn, which is why they wanted the Torah to stay in Shemayim. Even though Moshe Rabbeinu said, "What are you talking about? The Torah doesn't apply to you," because Moshe Rabbeinu is referring to the lower Torah. The lowest level of Torah is the Torah that we have in front of us, right, written on parchment. That's Chamisha Chumshei Torah. That's the lowest level of Torah. It's speaking only in physical terms. Kimat. There are 4 levels to that Torah alone. There's Pardes. Even within the written Torah, you have Pshat, Remez, Drash, and Sod. Pardes, Pei, Reish, Dalet, Samech. Right? So you have 4 levels to every word of Torah. You have the simple meaning, the Drush meaning, the Remez meaning, the hinted meaning, and then the Sod, the secret meaning, the Kabbalistic meaning. So even the Torah we have, there's 4 levels of it. But it keeps going higher and higher to the extent that where the Ramban said before the Torah was given, it's Kulo Shemos Hashem. It's all names of Hashem. It's jumbled up into names of Hashem. As the events took place, the letters reorganized themselves and they became the Torah that we have today. But that doesn't mean that Torah doesn't exist anymore. It just means that it doesn't exist down in this world. It's not the Torah we have down here. But there's many different dimensions of Torah that exist as you go up the chain into higher worlds. The Torah that the angels were learning, the Torah that they learn in the Yeshiva Shalmala, which we discussed that when people go to the next world, there's the Yeshiva of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai that spoke about the Zohar, a Yeshiva of Rav Chananya ben Hakana. There's different yeshivas in the higher worlds learning Torah that is not necessarily applicable to physical human beings. So what are they learning? So they're learning the different levels of Torah. They're learning all these different levels of Torah. In fact, the Ishbitzer, who's a great Hasidic master, he says something very, very interesting. I just heard in a shir by Rav named Rav Yossi Zakatinsky. And he says that this world, like we said, is sustained by Torah. The Torah is the blueprint for this world. So what sustains you when you're breaking the Torah? When you're going against Torah? If the Torah is reality and the Torah is the will of Hashem, so when you go against the will of Hashem, so essentially you're stepping out of reality. But Hashem, in His mercy, which Tomer Devora, the Sefer, speaks about this, Hashem in His mercy, He continues to sustain a person even when he's going against reality. Not going against His will, he's going against reality. So what's sustaining him? If the Torah says that anyone that breaks Shabbos will die, most of you must, he's going to die, you're going to kill him. So how are you alive when you break Shabbos? Like the Torah says, you die. So how do you live? How can anyone exist outside of the will of the Torah if the Torah is reality? So the Ishbitzer says something very, very deep. He says that that's the Torah in this world. What sustains you when you're going against the will of Hashem is the Torah as it exists in the higher worlds. The Torah in the higher worlds don't necessarily tell you that if you break Shabbos, you die. It doesn't look like that. It looks different. I don't know. There's no necessarily breaking Shabbos in the higher world. It's not the same. So there's a different level of Torah that is sustaining you when you're breaking Torah. So he just warns, don't think that you're connecting to a higher level and it's good to break Torah, because the Ratzon Hashem is that the Torah should come all the way down into the physical world and should be the Torah that we have down here. That's the Torah that we're supposed to follow. That's the Torah that gives Hashem the greatest kavod. That's a dira b'tachtonin. The Tani says the whole reason Hashem created the world was to create a dwelling place down in this physical world. So if you're going against that, so you're obviously breaking the entire purpose of creation. But there has to be some Torah that's sustaining you, otherwise you poof out of existence. So that's one of these higher dimensions of Torah, is what's actually sustaining reality when reality is going against the Ratzon Hashem. That's what he says. But he says that means that you're always connected to Hashem. He uses this idea to say that even the greatest choteh, the greatest sinner, when you bring him back into this reality, you can elevate that Torah that existed in the higher world. Because let's say a tzaddik is only existing on the lowest plane of reality. He's only existing on the lowest level of Torah. Because he's always connected to the Ratzon as it exists in the lowest physical world. So, right, that's what Hashem wants, obviously. That's the greatest tzaddik. That means he loves Hashem, he's nullified to Hashem. A rasha, so he's actually connecting to different dimensions of Torah. And if he does tshuva, so he elevates those aspects of his life that were once disconnected from Torah, which is a very great tikkun that he can accomplish. Right? That there's a certain aspect of becoming about tshuva that's greater than a tzaddik. So this is one of those facets to understanding what that means, is that he can elevate levels of Torah that are inaccessible in a good way to the tzaddik, at least in practice. Right? The tzaddik can learn those Torahs.
What do those other levels look like? What are they like?
So a taste of them is to get into Sod, people that understand Kabbalah, so they can understand Torah on a much deeper level. It doesn't look like every halacha that we said exists in pardes, pshat, remish, drash, and sod. So you can understand the sod of the thing itself as understanding the highest level of the Torah that we have, which is like the lowest link on the chain of the level that's above it. Like we said, it's all a chain. So the highest level, which is sod, so that's actually like the lowest level of that highest dimension of Torah. So someone that learns Kabbalah and they see how it's reflected in the Torah that we have down here, so then he'll get a taste of that. He'll get a taste of what that Torah is. To actually understand what that Torah is, we don't know until you go to the next world. We don't have access to that Torah. We're not supposed to have access to that Torah because Hashem's Ratzon is the Torah that's down here. That's the whole reason why we're in this world. But what we're going to learn for Yemot Mashiach, or for, let's say, Olam Haba, which is going to be an experience of connecting to deeper and deeper levels of Torah, is we're going to basically climb that chain. And it goes forever. Because Hashem is infinite and Hashem is one with the Torah, so that chain goes up forever. So when you get to Olam Haba, you're learning Torah, you're connecting to Torah in the deepest way possible, and you're going deeper and deeper forever. So like, what does that mean? There's only so much Torah you can learn. So no, because there's different dimensions of Torah, there's different levels of Torah. You can continue climbing that chain, and it never ends. Okay, so that's this idea of Torah. So in Tanya, here's our first source. We'll just see how the Tanya gives us a good understanding of Torah, but I don't know if there's going to be any chidushim outside of what we said, but we'll get a very clear picture of it. He says, Hashem constricted himself and his will and his wisdom into the 613 mitzvos and into their halachas. And it's very interesting. And into the combination of letters of Tanakh. Right? So this is what we were speaking about earlier, that it's not just the words themselves. Hashem is contained within that combination of letters. And also in the Midrashei Chazal, which are also part and parcel of the Torah. Hashem constricts himself into those as well. So that every single human being, on all the different levels that his soul exists, is able to grasp them conceptually. And he'll be able to be mekayim the Torah, and is very important, on 3 different levels. Machshava, Dibur, and Maisa. So the Tanya speaks earlier, and he says that every soul has 3 levushim, 3 pieces of clothing that are called thought, speech, and deed. We've been speaking about it up until now in the previous shiurim to try to understand this, but when you speak to a person, you're not speaking to a body, you're speaking to a soul. A soul cannot express itself in this world. So Hashem gave it garments, He gave it clothing. And the clothing of the soul are thought, speech, and deed. So you can actualize your neshama through your thoughts, through your speaking, and through what you do. That's how your neshama operates in the world. So when a person is learning Torah, his neshama can't just plug itself into Torah, because you're in a body. Whenever your neshama is trapped in the body, it has to operate through the levushim. It has to work with the tools that are at its disposal, right? Which are the dibur, machshav, and maisa.
That's the body.
Which is the body and the thought. It's also the body and it's the intellect, which is like a little bit higher than the body. So when a person's learning Torah, so he's connecting these articles of clothing, the clothing of his neshama, to Hashem. That's what he's doing. And thereby connecting his soul to Hashem. There's no way to plug your soul into God without going through the levushim. And there's no way to go through the levushim to get to Hashem without Torah and mitzvos. That's the whole Tanya, the whole Mesilas Yesharim. Look at the first parak of Mesilas Yesharim. It's this exact concept. Mesilas Yesharim says the whole reason a person was created was not for this world, it's for Olam Haba. But to get to Olam Haba, you have to be placed in this world. The only things in this world that can actually get you to Olam Haba are Torah and mitzvos. Ipso facto, you're placed in this world to do Torah and mitzvos. That's the name of the game. And to the extent to which a person can understand that and believe it, is the extent to which he will succeed in this world. That's what Mesilas Yesharim says. That's why Mesilas Yesharim says, read me over and over and over again. You're not going to necessarily learn a chiddush, but you're going to keep your eye on the prize. You won't have any novel idea, but you'll continue to remember that you're only here for Torah mitzvahs. So whenever you're going to have a contradiction during your day between making money and fulfilling the will of Hashem and not, committing an isser to make that money, so it's going to be so obvious what your decision is going to be that it won't be so difficult. Because if you're going to have to steal or do something unethical to get that money, so that's not why you're here. That's not going to accomplish anything for your eternity. It's almost the silliest decision you'll ever make. Right? People think that when you give up your life for Hashem, Mesiras Nefesh, so it's an illogical, they call it lamala min hadas, that's what the Tanya calls it. It's a decision that's above understanding. Because your intellect, or at least your instinct, is telling you that the only reason you're here in this world is to survive. Yeah.
I'm sorry, so does that mean that Goyim who are following the 7 laws of Noah cannot make it to Allah?
No, they could.
Period? Or, but when you say the only way is toward mitzvah,
The 7 mitzvahs are part of Torah mitzvahs. That's their mitzvahs. That's their Torah. Right?
okay.
They're supposed to learn all those halachas. They have to learn it. But they have their aspect of Torah mitzvahs as well. Going for sure can have a certain level of olam haba. It won't be like a Jewish level, but again, they can always convert if they wanted to. So bottom line is anyone can actually reach that olam haba if they so choose. But they can still get a lower level of olam haba if they do their mitzvahs and they learn their Torah. So we were just saying, what were we just saying? In the middle of an idea.
That was survivalist, and we wanted to do it right, which would mean that you would go ahead and do Torah mitzvahs because everything else is not.
Because everything else is nothing. So therefore, your only way to get to olam haba is through Torah and mitzvahs. Okay, there was something I was going to say, but I forgot.
You want to steal.
You would never
Say you
steal.
never steal.
Then I got to something right after that. I said you never steal, of course, because you'd be losing your olam haba. It would be a very obvious decision. Okay, maybe I'll remember another time. Okay, fine. So this is what he's telling us right now. Okay, okay. And therefore, Torah is compared to water. Why is it compared to water? Just like Torah trickles down from a much higher place to a much lower place. Sorry, just like water will always travel down from a higher place to a lower place. So too the Torah trickled down from its lofty place where it's literally one with Hashem. It's the wisdom and will of Hashem. Umisham nasa v'yarad b'seiser madregos, and it went through all these secret levels, madregla, v'shashos alamas, ash nisalabsha b'dvarim gashmim v'yana olmazeh, until it actually clothed itself in the physical world. Shein rov mitzvos haTorah kekulim v'ilchasei, which is all the mitzvahs. That's what the mitzvahs are. V'tzirufei osios gashmius b'dio al sefer, and it literally is the letters that are written with ink on a klaf of a sefer Torah. Esim v'arba svarim shebetorah neviim ktuvim all of Tanakh, kadei shtei kol machshava tfisa behen, so that your intellect can now grasp them. That's why Hashem gave us Torah. Torah is the greatest paradox that exists in the world. It's infinite and yet it's finite. Right? Hashem took His infinite will and He packaged it into Torah for the sole reason that we should now be able to connect our intellect to the divine intellect. Through learning Torah and through our speaking Torah and through our fulfilling mitzvahs. Right? That's acting on Torah. Those 3 levushim of the neshama are how we plug into Hashem. Now the next source goes much deeper, and it's what we were just discussing earlier about when a person is disconnected from Hashem. He's disconnected from Torah. So how is he surviving? So this is Rabbi Nachman in a very famous piece on the Likutei Moharan. Many people will know the song. Afilu behastara shebetoch hastara. So that's, no, okay, you should learn. It's a good song. Okay, we'll send that on the WhatsApp group after. Fine, so he says, this is from this Rabbi Nachman. So he says, V'da. Shatorah hamalubash toch hastara shebetoch hastara. So let me just give it the background. It's very, very quick, but it's a very deep and important idea. There's 2 levels of Hastara that exist in this world. This Torah is actually speaking about Purim, so it's very apropos for what we're getting to right now. One is where Hashem is hiding from a person, but the person is looking for Hashem. Meaning the person knows that Hashem is hiding. So very often you'll have days or weeks or even years that go by where you're not feeling connected to Hashem or to the Torah, but you're trying. You know you're not connected. You know you're missing something. There's a hole inside of a person, and he knows that what he's missing is Hashem. He knows he's missing God. He doesn't know exactly how to get there, but he knows that Hashem is hidden. And he sees a lot of pain and suffering in his life. Things aren't going the way he thinks they should. And that's called a Hastara, that Hashem is hidden from him. Hashem is not shining His face. Okay. Then there's something much more scary, which is called Hastara b'toch Hastara. Hastir astir es panei b'yom. Hashem says in the Torah, I will hide my face, but He says it twice. Hastir hastir, that astir hastir, that I will double hide my face. So the Gemara actually darshans Esther b'Torah minayin. Where do we see Esther Hamalka in the Torah? And it says that pasuk, astir astir es panei. I will double hide my face. That was Purim. Purim was a double hiding. What does it mean to double hide? It means that Hashem hides himself, like the previous case, but then he hides himself again, so that you're so lost that you're not even looking for Hashem. You don't even know that he's hiding, so you're not even looking. It's like when a kid goes to play hide and seek and no one looks for him. It's very sad, right? It's like Hashem's playing hide and seek, and he didn't tell you, so you're kind of just going about your day. You're not looking for Hashem. Now it's interesting. That's really where the majority of Jews find themselves today, which is the sad part. That they don't even know what they're missing. You can call it ignorance. It's like a sad ignorance. You can blame the religious spectrum of the Jewish people for why we're not educating them, but we're doing our best with Chabad and Aish and all these different movements that are trying to reach everyone. But it's a movement of ignorance that Hashem is hiding. It's not ignorance only of Torah. It's that they don't even know that they're missing something. It's the deepest level of Hashem hiding himself. Hastara. It's a double hiding. And it's very, very hard to pull out of that. Because if you don't know Hashem is hiding, so then you're not searching. If you're not searching, how are you going to find him? For that type of hiding, so usually you need someone else to kind of like pick you up. You need someone else to tap you on the shoulder and say, Hashem's playing hide and seek. I said, what? Who's Hashem? Okay, then you have to explain how it works. But that's really the Kiruv movement today, is not necessarily having to convince people that the Torah is true. It's just to let them know that there's something called Torah, or that there's something called Hashem. Like they don't even know. They don't even know that he's hiding. They have no idea. So that's really the challenge. But that's Hastara b'toch Hastara. So that's what Rabbi Nachman's talking about over here. So back to the first line. Torah melubash toch Hastara b'toch Hastara. So guess what? There's Torah that's sustaining a person within that double hiding. There's a Torah that's there. Because the Torah is everything, right? The Torah is reality. So there's a Torah that's there. He Torah gavoa daika. Listen to this. And this is what we were just speaking about. This is actually a higher level of Torah. It's a very high level of Torah that has to be sustaining that place. Hainu sisrei Torah, meaning the deeper levels of Torah, the secrets of Torah. And this is a rule in Kabbalah. Whenever something that's very dark or something that's very impure needs to be sustained by Hashem, it has to be something very, very lofty that's sustaining it. Only the most potent sparks of Kedusha can sink to that level of darkness and sustain that object or that person in that place. Which is why when a Rasha does tshuva, there's no greater simcha in Shamayim. The Zohar says that, and this really was like, is a motivation for anyone that's in Kiruv, and most Kiruv Sfarim bring the Zohar. There's a Zohar that says that if a person knew what his Olam Haba would look like and what would happen in the higher worlds, if he could take a Rasha and turn him into a tzaddik, then he would literally be chasing that avoda all day long. He would just go into Kiruv, and that would be all he would want to do all day long. If he only saw what would happen when you take a Jewish neshama, and even one, right? Right now it's like a numbers game. You got to send like 50 people to Israel to get paid. Like it doesn't work. Even one neshama is a whole world. Your Olam Haba would be greater than anything you could ever imagine. And we're not doing it selfishly for the Olam Haba, but the point is what it accomplishes when you take one neshama, because that neshama has a very special spark in it. And all the actions that person did when he was in those deep, dark places, they exist in eternity. If you get him to do tshuva, so you can elevate all those sparks back to Hashem. You can rectify all the damage that was done. So this is telling us that not only was there something sustaining him during those periods of darkness, it was the deepest aspects of Torah that were kind of traveling down in that submarine into those dark places that were keeping him alive. Hainu etzel elu she'avru harbe. So by these that are avru harbe, by the habitual sinners, ad she'nistar mehem be'hastara b'toch hastara, until they reach that point that we said is a double hiding, that they're just sinning so habitually that they don't even know that Hashem's hiding from them. They don't even know what they're missing. Al kein chashav Hashem yizbarach machshavos levli lahal bisham pshatei Torah. So this is a deeper concept that we're not going to get into, but Hashem didn't want to put the pshat of Torah in those places to sustain them, because then the forces of impurity would have been able to suck their life force from those aspects of Torah, and it would have caused a great deficiency in the world. So so therefore he puts a very lofty Torah in that place. Sisrei Torah, shehi Torah Hashem ba'atzma, which is the Torah of Hashem himself, which again we said, the name of Hashem, that's the Ramban, it's all names of Hashem. So therefore, the klipos, the forces of impurity, can't can't suck so much life force from that person when he's in that place. Okay, that's a deeper concept we're not going to get into, but the idea is clear, is that the darker you go, the deeper the Torah that's sustaining those places, because again, the pshat of Torah can't sustain you there, because the pshat of Torah says, if you break Shabbos, you die. So it can't be sustaining a guy who's being Mechal Shabbos. So it has to be a deeper level of Torah. So that's his concept
And
of
it's
Torah.
not Rachamim who's sustaining them?
No, for sure, yeah. Rachamim is for sure. We're asking on a technical understanding of what's sustaining them in terms of the blueprint of reality. In terms of why Hashem is sustaining them, so that's Rachamim, right? That's Rachamim. Rachamim that Hashem, again, he's never going to overcome his mishpat. He's never going to just let them slide, but he's going to be marich hapecha. He's going to give them time to do tshuva. He's going to give them opportunities to do tshuva. Like this is all Mesilas Yesharim that Hashem ways about Rachamim. He doesn't let you go scot-free. There's no get out of jail free, but he'll break up the punishment into small pieces. He does all these things that encourage a person to do tshuva. But that's more with Hashem's hanhaga of how he interacts with the Jewish people. This is more the technical understanding of what's sustaining them in that place. Okay, now we're going to do Nevuah. It looks like a lot, but it's not really, because all of these examples I brought here, symbolic acts of a Navi, are really trying to understand the second question on our sheet that we have in the English section, which says, why does God tell prophets to do symbolic actions that represent their prophecies? Is it just for dramatic effect? So I brought here, I think it's like 9 examples or 8 examples, where Hashem tells a Navi some prophetic message of some disaster that's going to happen, or
what do you see over here? Take
no,
a
not that
piece of
one.
wood.
He says what he's this is what he already said, and he tells you to do something. He tells you to do something. So the first one that ever happened is Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu at the bris bein besarim gets this whole nevuah of Shibud Mitzrayim and what's going to happen to the Jewish people through all of Galus, and Hashem tells him to take all these animals and chop them up and to pass through the middle, and there was a lantern that was passing through the middle. Some very interesting actions that Avram was supposed to do. So the question is, why do you have to do that? A nevuah, in the simplest understanding, is just the deliverance of a message. It's just delivering a message. Why would anyone need to do a symbolic action attached to that message? Why would you need to do that? Here in Yechezkel, Hashem tells him to actually take a kir of barzel, an iron wall, and to place it between himself and the city to represent that the city is now going to have a matzor. Matzor is a siege, that there's going to be a siege placed on that city. Almost as if Yechezkel is like bringing about the siege by placing this big iron sheet between himself and the city. So why was that necessary? If Hashem wants to put a city into siege, he could just do it. If he wants to let Yechezkel know that that's going to happen, so he can just tell him. There was many nevuahs that Hashem just told the Navi, right? Why does he have to do that? Yeshua, Hashem says, when you're going to destroy Ha'ai, the city, so how do you destroy it? Stick out your spear and point it at the city.
Because telling isn't enough. You have to also demonstrate things also. Demonstration is part of the act of telling.
Why? It's not Hashem demonstrating. He told them to do something.
Yeah, right. But that's part of the thing. That's what we do on Pesach. We not only tell, but we also do things to demonstrate the Yetzias Mitzrayim.
So that's okay. We'll see that can be a very simplified answer. That is to teach him. You don't really. I mean, that's because the mitzvah is to see yourself like you're leaving Mitzrayim. There's no mitzvah to see yourself like you're putting a siege on the city. When Hashem says He's going to destroy the city, there's no mitzvah for you to point out the spear when Hashem says I'm going to destroy the city. We'll see some other cases over here. Here's another one that many people are familiar with. The last one, Yechezkel, that Hashem said when He's ultimately going to bring Mashiach and He's going to reunite the 10 tribes with the tribe of Yehuda, which is the last source in Yechezkel. He says, take 2 sticks, write on one Yehuda and write on one Ephraim, put them together, and then they're going to unite and become one stick. And that's going to be representative of the fact that the kingdoms are eventually going to come back together. So like, why? Why do you have to do that? Just this, it's very nice, you're right, it does add dramatic effect. That would be like the answer, that it's to teach a person, to add dramatic effect so that the teaching is more meaningful. But is that it? Is that really what it was? So, okay, you can see a few more on here. One, he says Elisha to shoot an arrow, and just like the arrow flies and it hits something, it's going to destroy that thing. So there's many examples of this, where Hashem tells a Navi to demonstrate the Nevuah with an action. And the question is why. So this is going to be very important to Avodas Hashem and to understand our actions in this world. and how they can actually bring about something that's waiting for us in the future. Okay. Now to understand this, just give one quick example. Okay. Everything that we learned up until now, that everything that exists in this world exists in a spiritual state in the higher world. And then it filters down until it manifests as something physical. So like as if there's like a wire that's connecting anything in this world up to the higher world, and when you shake it down here, it shakes something up there. That's what we understood until now. Now, the big chiddush is that does not only apply to matter, to the physical object itself. It also applies to events that will take place. Everything that will take place in this world begins up there. And that event trickles down until it comes down here. Now, this is not just a Torah concept. This is what the astrologers in Egypt were doing. We knew that they could look at the stars and tell the future. What does that mean? So they were able to understand the map of the spiritual world, to see events as they were forming before they came down into the world. Just like you can see storm clouds that are gathering, and you know that eventually it's going to materialize into rain. So you can see the spiritual happenings before they happen in the physical world. You can see that the storm clouds gathering, or the bracha gathering. Tzaddikim, right, who are very connected to the higher worlds, who spend, like we mentioned, more time in the higher world than they do in this world, or they're so plugged into Torah, they can have this ability that we call Ruach HaKodesh to know the future. How do they know the future? Because they're just 2 steps ahead of us. They have premonitions. The Chassam Sofer is very famous for this. He used to very often have dreams that would tell the future. Very often he would dream events that were going to take place. Sometimes he was awake and he would see, there's a unbelievable story where he was awake and he was by his window and he saw the gabbai of the shul wearing tachrichim, wearing a kittel, walking through the cemetery. And when he went downstairs, he told the Kehillah that we all have to start saying Tehillim. And they started fervently saying Tehillim. And this man walked in, he wasn't wearing a kittel, and he said, what are we doing? He said, we're saying Tehillim. For who? I don't know, we're saying Tehillim. So they all said Tehillim, very, very strong. And the Chassam Sofer said, it didn't work. He felt that it didn't work. And that person, the Kehillah, died the next day. Chassam Sofer had a premonition that he was going to die, and he tried to do something for him while he was awake. And but by the Chassam Sofer, this happened very often. Before he lived in Pressburg. Before there was a war, he had visions of crazy battles and things that were taking place, and he warned the city before the war happened. He was warning his Kehillah that they should flee. This is like actual documented events that this happened very often with Chassam Sofer. So how do you do that? So because he was so deeply connected to the spiritual world that he would actually feel the things before they took place. They say that dogs, right? The Gemara says that Nevuah, prophecy, only exists in 3 places. Hizmanenu, in our times. What are they? So it says in children, crazy people, and in dogs. Children, crazy people, and dogs. So what does that mean? It means these individuals, they don't have access to the world the way that we do. They don't, like children can't speak yet. Crazy people also, they're not connected to the physical world as it exists for us. We don't know what it's like to be a crazy person, but I'll tell you one thing: it's not the same as being a non-crazy person, right? There are some advantages. Right? They comprehend reality in a different way. Their soul works in a different way. See, if you think a crazy person is just someone who's messed up, and his soul is messed up, so okay, so he's just messed up. So he's just like, his soul is also just like this thing that just doesn't understand. But that's not necessarily true. It could be that his vessel is lacking, but his soul is exactly the same as yours and mine. So maybe if a soul doesn't necessarily have to deal with logic and intellect, it can actually grasp things that are beyond our grasp, because we have to work through logic and intellect. Certain things that limit us in a good way because it enables us to function in the world, but they're not limited by those things. And we don't know what a baby's thinking, so we think a baby is like doesn't know anything because he's a baby, but maybe he knows something that he just can't express. And does he really know it? He doesn't know it in an intellectual way, but he knows it in a much deeper way. You just can't access it. So you could go online and see that there's cases where when natural disasters were about to occur, dogs started going crazy. It's like a known fact that dogs have a sixth sense, so they say. So what does that mean? It means that Hashem for some reason made this creature with access to feel the storm clouds before it starts to rain. The spiritual storm clouds. Right? So they can feel it before it happens. So a nevuah is Hashem telling a prophet that something is going to happen before it actually happens. Now, if it's a nevuah tova, the Rambam says that anytime Hashem tells you something positive, it has to happen in a nevuah. It has to happen. No matter what, it's not gonna come back empty. However, if he tells you something negative, so you actually have an opportunity to blow away the storm clouds. You can actually change things before they happen. But Hashem telling you, this is prepared. The Navi actually sees the event in the higher world. He sees it. That's the vision that he's given. He's given the vision of what's happening in the higher world. It just hasn't come down here yet. Okay, so now that we understand that that's how Nevuah works and that's how everything in this world operates, all happenings of the world. So how does a Navi operate? What's his job? So it's very interesting. What his job is not only is he given a premonition of what is going to occur, he's actually the tool that's going to activate the process which will bring it into the world. When a Navi speaks his Nevuah, it's drawing that spiritual event down. And not only that, when he speaks it, but when he does a maisa, when he does an action that's representative of that event, it pulls it even further down into the world. To a point where there's almost no going back. When he brings it all the way down. This isn't just Nevuah. This is a very amazing source here. That's very, very deep source. We'll do it inside here. It's Rav Chaim Vital in Shari Kedusha. Rav Chaim Vital here is quoting a sefer called Shar Kavana, which is Rav Real of Girona. Rav Real of Girona was one of the earliest Kabbalists that we know of. He was the Rebbe of the Ramban, which was like, whoa, Rebbe of the Ramban. He was the Talmud of someone named Rav Yitzchak Sagi Nahor, Rabbi Yitzchak the blind, who was the Talmud of someone named the Ravid. There's many Ravids, but this is the Ravid who's like one of the earliest Kabbalists. These are like the earliest Kabbalists from the times of like Rishon Bar Yochai until you get to these names. We don't really know where the line went, but these are like the early names that wrote these early Sfarim. So this is Real of Girona, the Rebbe of the Ramban. So we'll try to do it quickly. He says, he's talking about how you daven. You know, I'll say it outside. This is how you daven. So he's going in the Gemara in Brachos. The Gemara in Brachos said that the Chasidim Harishonim would spend 9 hours a day davening. What did they do for 9 hours a day? So they had an hour to prepare for tefillah, an hour davening, and an hour coming down from their tefillah. So if you understand meditation, so there is a mahalach that meditation takes time to enter into a meditative state. Then you can accomplish things within the meditative state, and then it takes time to come out of the meditative state. Okay, so they were doing something that was very close to meditation. It was a meditative prayer. That's what davening is ideally supposed to be. It's supposed to be a meditation. So they spent an hour preparing their mind, machshava. They spent an hour davening, dibur, and what did they do in the third hour? What did they do for the third hour? So Real of Girona says, you know what they did? They thought of a maisa, of a symbolic action that would represent that which they davened for. What were they doing when they davened? And this is what tefillah is supposed to be. On a very deep level, there's many aspects to davening. On the deepest level of davening is you go up to the higher world, you can create something, and then you can bring it down. Obviously, through davening to Hashem, through nullifying yourself to Hashem. The dibur, he says, itself, he says they would move their mouths in a way that you would actually create the letters with their physical mouths. They'd like speak out the letter, and he says they'd speak out the letter in a very serious way so that it would create the letters. You create the dibur, the letters, like we said, the letters of creation. We said that the letters of Hebrew actually have a creative force in them. Betzalel built the Mishkan with the letters of creation. They create the letters, and then they bring it down into the world with a physical action. This is the secret of Nevuah. He says at the very end that this is how you reach Nevuah. They would reach, this was really, there's something called B'nai Nevi'im. in Tanakh, there's Nevi'im and there's the Bnei Nevi'im. The Bnei Nevi'im were the students of the Navi. That's how they learned Nevuah. She says this is how they would learn Nevuah. It would be a deep meditation, a very deep meditation, and they learn how to navigate the higher worlds until Hashem would eventually give them messages and kind of plug them in. Okay, so this is what the Nevi'im were doing. They were actually drawing it down. Now listen to this wild story, and we'll finish with this. This is an unbelievable illustration of this idea. This is a story about the Balatanya, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe. Okay, this is a wild story. So, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe was obviously a great Hasidic master and a big tzaddik, and this is as early as 200 years ago, even in Chavetz Chaim's time, there was still a phenomenon called dibuk. Have you ever heard of a dibuk?
Yeah, Rechonim Wasserman.
Yeah, Rechonim Wasserman. That's what I'm saying. Yeah, which was Chavetz Chaim's time. Yeah, Rechonim Wasserman. So a dibuk is someone who's possessed by a spirit. It's interesting that we don't see them, or maybe we just don't hear about them. But it was a very real thing, and it happened. The biggest gedolim that were very rational thinkers write openly about dibukim, that a spirit would possess a person, and when he would open his mouth, a voice would come out without him moving his mouth. There would be a voice speaking. They would ask him questions sometimes to the dibuk. They'd find out which neshama it was. Generally, it was someone that did a very, very serious avera, and that was forced to wander the earth. And eventually, they would find a host. Somehow, they were able to attach themselves to that person. It was called an ibur, which means a person became pregnant, which means they had a second neshama in their body, like a pregnancy with another neshama in their body. And they would go to a tzaddik to try to get the dibuk out. Sometimes with success, sometimes it wouldn't get to a tzaddik. And a person, you think he's crazy, he's schizophrenic, but he really just had another neshama inside of him. Could be what schizophrenia is, right? In the spiritual sense. We don't really understand, but there was another neshama inside of a person. So someone brought an individual who was possessed to the Balatani. And he was sitting in the room with this person who was possessed by the dibuk with these yechidei segula, which some of his very close tzaddikim, close chasidim, who are also tzaddikim, big people. And the Balatanya, instead of conversing with his dibuk, he started giving over a Dvar Torah. He started speaking about Dvar Torah. He says, do you know Zechariah, the Kohen Gadol, who was also a Navi in the Beis HaMikdash? We spoke about him in a previous year. He was giving a nevuah that the Beis HaMikdash was going to be destroyed, and they stoned him to death. And the Jewish people that were there in the Hastara, they stoned him to death. Different accounts, it was on Yom Kippur, according to some. Terrible, terrible chait. So the Balatani says, do you know why they stoned him to death? Like, it's a pretty wild thing to picture. They're in the Beis HaMikdash on Yom Kippur. They're clearly from people. A Navi comes out and tells them that the Beis HaMikdash is going to be destroyed if you don't do tshuva, and they kill him. Like, we're not dealing with a bunch of low riffraff that were hanging out in the Beis HaMikdash on Yom Kippur, right? How could that have happened?
So his words don't manifest.
So the Balatanya says, you know why they did it? Yeah, they did it because they were trying to save the Kvod HaShamayim that was in the world. That if the Navi were to speak his Nevuah, so then he would have drawn it down into the world, and it would have been so much harder to turn it back. So if they would have been able to kill him before he was able to speak his Nevuah, they could have saved the Beis HaMikdash.
Or they thought he was a false prophet.
But he already
He was
spoke
the
it.
Kohen Gadol. They didn't doubt his prophecy, according to Balatanya.
He already spoke
So they were trying to kill him before he spoke it.
But he did speak it. That's why they killed him.
No, but there was more Nevuah to come. Nevuah is not two words. Beis HaMikdash will be destroyed. There's a whole. Have you ever read the Navi? They go through a very long. They like to give Musar. Right? There's gonna be a whole long Musar speech. Maybe all the curses, and they're gonna take all your family and your children and give them slaves. Read all the curses in the Torah. I mean, it goes on for pages and pages. So they wanted to nip it. They wanted to stop it. So that's why they killed him. So Balatanya asks. He said, so why didn't Zechariah give over his own life to not give the nevuah? Because a navi that has a prophecy and doesn't give it over is chayiv misa b'dei shemayim. He dies. He gets killed. If you have a nevuah and you don't give it over, like Yonah, right? Yonah didn't want to give over his nevuah, so he was going to die, and then he was willing to give it over, so this fish spit him out. But so he says, why didn't he sacrifice his own life to not give over the nevuah to save the Beis HaMikdash? So the Balatani answered, because he had such sacrifice, he was so nullified to the kavod of Hashem, that he knew that the Ratzon Hashem was to destroy the Beis HaMikdash. So as much as he loved the Beis HaMikdash and loved what it was doing for the world and for the Jewish people, he loved Hashem even more, and he would rather fulfill the Ratzon Hashem and sacrifice himself for the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash than to sacrifice himself for the sustaining the Beis HaMikdash. Okay, that's what he says. So he said that Dvar Torah, and then suddenly the dibuk left. The guy was like cured. So when the person left the room, he thanked the Baal Tanya, he left the room, and the people with him asked, like, Rebbe, like, my hi, what just happened? So he said, that neshama was one of the people who stoned Zechariah. And when I saw him, when I saw the dibuk, I knew that that's which the neshama was. And because I was melamed zchus on what they did, even though what they did was wrong, he didn't say what they did was right. He said, of course it was wrong, it was not the Ratzon Hashem. But he said that they had good intentions. That was enough to get him into Gehenna. That neshama was so wicked that it wasn't given access to Gehenna. Couldn't even get into Gehenna. So yeah,
he's already on his way up.
Yeah, the neshamas that are in this world that end up being dibukim, they're usually they're so bad and wicked that Hashem doesn't even let them go through the purification process of Gehenna. They're stuck in this world. So he said, I got him into Gehenna with being Melamed Zchus on that level. So it's a roundabout way to make our point, but this story illustrates the fact that when a person speaks something, so he brings it into reality. So a very important message, and Chavetz Chaim speaks about this very often in his Sfarim, is that watch what you say. Be very careful with what you say, and even more so with what you do. There's a story of the Baal Shem Tov that he was with his Talmidim, and one of his Talmidim, I forget why, but he mentioned that this person should be torn apart. He's a terrible person. I hope he, and the Baal Shem Tov, suddenly they cringed and got like, oh. I said, Rebbe, he's a terrible person, he's a Rasha. And he said, gather round. Did they gather round? They all held hands, and suddenly all of them had this vision of that person literally being torn apart. And they saw like his flesh and his bones being torn apart, and they all were super frightened. And the Baal Tanya says, this is what happens when you speak these words. In a certain level, he actually gets torn apart. Your words actually create a metzius. They create an existence where this thing happens. Now, is it going to happen in reality? It depends if Hashem's going to bring it down into the world or not. But you actually can affect that by bringing it, by speaking it. The Rabbi Nachman says when you judge a person, it actually affects his judgment in Shemayim. If you judge him l'kaf zchus, he will actually have his scales tipped. If you judge him l'kaf chova, if you judge him guilty, he will actually have his scales tipped. A Jew can actually affect the heavenly judgment. That's your machshava. Your machshava can create things. It can actually affect things. Your dibur, even more so. Be very careful with what you say. Don't waste words. Don't say anything you don't mean, because it has a real effect. It might not actually happen, but in a certain sense, it will bring that reality closer to this world. And be very careful about what you do, because whenever Hashem told the Navi to do this symbolic act, that was like the nail in the coffin. That was Hashem bringing that spiritual rain cloud all the way down into the world, to the extent that there was no turning back. Once a Navi did it, there was no turning back. So a person has to be very careful about what he does, but also just take it to the opposite, like we saw in Real of Girona. When you daven, realize the koach of your tefillas. When you daven for something, or you give a person a bracha, or you wish him a mazel tov, you really can accomplish something. Right? Why do you make a kiddush for your son and your daughter and a shalom zachar? Because you know how many mazel tovs you get that night? Don't take that for granted. Like, have a big sack. Whenever a guy wishes, he says, comes over and says mazel tov, give me a real bracha. Right? Get those brachas. Because a Jew giving a bracha shouldn't be kal be'enav, even a hedyot. The Gemara says, it doesn't matter who's giving the bracha. When a Jew gives a bracha, why? Because his words can affect reality. His bracha means something. He says, no, I know he's a nice guy. He wishes me well. No, get him to say it. If anything, get him to symbolically describe it. I don't know. Right? That's what he says that the Chasidim Rishonim were to do. But you can actually bring things into the world when you use your machshava, your dibur, and your maisa in the right way. And you can cause serious damage when you use them in the wrong way. So that's just another layer to this concept of how we can affect the higher worlds.
Very good.